The girl did not remember a time before the dust. It was the first thing she tasted in the morning and the last thing she felt on her skin at night. A fine grit that worked its way into the folds of her dress, into the creases of her chapped lips, into the very weave of her silence. She stood tied to a hitching post outside the saloon, the coarse rope a familiar weight against her wrists. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the cracked earth of the town square, on the warped wood of the buildings, on her own bowed head. Her hair, a fall of black river stone, clung to her neck with sweat. She was barefoot, the soles of her feet calloused to the point of numbness against the hot, shifting ground. She had learned not to see the faces in the crowd. They were a blur of judgment, a murmur of speculation that rose and fell like the buzzing of flies. Some spat, some laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that chipped away at the stillness she had built around herself. Most just watched with a flat, sun-drained curiosity, as if she were a new breed of livestock brought in for auction. They were a single creature, this crowd, its breath smelling of cheap whiskey and self-righteousness. She kept her eyes fixed on a loose board on the saloon porch, counting the splinters. It was a way to anchor herself in the world without having to be part of it. A man named Carlton owned the saloon, and for now he owned her. He was a man whose softness was a kind of decay, his belly straining the buttons of his waistcoat. He stood on the porch, leaning against a support beam, a half-smoked cigarillo pinched between his fingers. He gestured toward her with it. "A good hand," he'd said to the men around the poker table inside, his voice slick with drink and pride. "A real good hand gets you more than just the pot," and so, she had become the pot. An object passed over a stained felt table along with a pile of tarnished coins and spent luck. She did not look up when a new shadow fell near her. It was different from the others. It did not shift or jostle for a better view. It was still, solid, a column of quiet in the sea of noise. She could feel the weight of its gaze, not like the picking curiosity of the others, but like a stone dropped into a deep well. It was a gaze that didn't just look at her, but seemed to measure the very air around her. From the corner of her eye, she saw worn leather boots, caked in the reddish-brown dust of the far ranges. The legs above them were clad in denim faded to the color of a winter sky. A long duster, frayed at the hem, hung loose, carrying the scent of horse and distance and something else, something like old sorrow. She risked a glance upward, past a worn belt buckle to a face weathered like an old fence post. His eyes were the color of faded denim, too, and they held whole winters in their depths. They were tired eyes, haunted eyes, but they were not cruel. He wasn't looking at her like a prize. He was looking at her like a problem he hadn't decided how to solve. The man, whose name was Elias, had not come to town for this. He had come for salt bricks and flour, a trip he made only when the emptiness of his cupboards echoed the emptiness of his house too loudly. He had stood at the edge of the crowd, intending to pass by, but the stillness of the girl had caught him. She was thin as a fence rail, a child trying to wear the armor of a woman, and failing. He saw the way she held herself, a rigid quiet that was louder than any scream. He recognized the shape of a soul that had retreated so far inside itself there was barely any room left to breathe. He turned and walked into the saloon. The air inside was thick with stale smoke and the sweet, cloying smell of spilled liquor. Carlton was back at the table, preening, collecting his winnings. Elias walked straight to him. The other men fell silent, watching. Elias was not a man for saloons. He was a ghost from the high plains, a man most people only knew by the cattle he drove to market once a year. He didn't speak. He just laid a small, heavy leather pouch on the table. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. Carlton looked up, his eyes narrowing. "What's this, Elias?" "Looking for a game." Elias shook his head once. His voice, when it came, sounded like it came from under floorboards, low and unused. "The girl." A slow, greasy smile spread across Carlton's face. "She ain't for sale. She's a marker. Owed to me." He puffed out his chest. "Property." Elias pushed the pouch forward another inch with a single, calloused finger. You owe me for that bull last spring. You never paid. Carlton's smile faltered. It was true. A debt left to fester. This is different. The pouch covers the debt and then some, Elias said. His eyes flickered toward the door, toward the slice of brutal sunlight where the girl still stood. Call it interest, or call it me taking what I'm owed. Your choice. The air in the room was tight as a fist. Carlton looked at the pouch, then at the hard, unyielding set of Elias's jaw. He saw no room for argument there, only consequence. He was a man who understood power, and while his was loud and fleshy, he recognized the quiet, dangerous kind that lived in men like Elias. With a grunt of disgust, he snatched the pouch. Take the stray, then. More trouble than she's worth. Elias turned without another word and walked back out into the blinding light. He approached her slowly, as one might approach a spooked horse. She flinched when he reached for her whole body tensing for a blow. But he didn't touch her skin. He took out a small, worn pocketknife, its blade honed to a silver sliver. With two swift, precise motions, he sawed through the ropes at her wrists. The scratch of the blade against the hemp was the loudest sound in the world. The ropes fell away. She instinctively rubbed her wrists, the skin beneath raw and bruised. She kept her head down, waiting for the next command, the next shackle. Come on, he said, his voice still that same low rumble. He didn't wait for an answer, just turned and started walking, his long strides eating up the dusty ground. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He just assumed she would. For a long moment, she remained rooted to the spot, a creature untethered and unsure. Then, placing one foot in front of the other, she began to follow the receding shape of the man in the long coat, leaving the town and its staring eyes behind her. The dust lifted behind them like ghosts. The journey to his homestead was a long, silent procession. The sun beat down, and the only sound was the scuff of their feet on the parched earth and the constant, whispering sigh of the wind. He walked ahead, a steady, unhurried pace that she found she could match without straining. He never looked back, yet she felt his awareness of her, a silent tether between them. After an hour, he stopped. He unslung a canteen from his shoulder and drank, then held it out to her. She hesitated, her eyes darting to his face, searching for a trick. There was none. There was only the water offered. She took it, her hand trembling slightly, and drank. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the first act of kindness she had received in a time she could not measure. She drank until her throat no longer felt like sandpaper, then handed it back. Their fingers did not touch. He nodded once and they continued on. The land grew harsher, stonier. The world was painted in shades of brown and gray and the pale, bleached blue of the sky. It was a landscape that offered no comfort, only the hard truth of survival. Finally, she saw it on the horizon. A small, weather-beaten house, a barn with a slightly listing roof, and a few skeletal corrals. It was a place that seemed to have been carved out of the wilderness with sheer, stubborn will. It was isolated, stark, a solitary ship on a sea of rock and dust. As they drew closer, she saw a single tree near the house, a twisted cottonwood that had somehow found enough life to grow. Beneath it was a small, fenced-off plot of earth with a simple wooden cross. The sight sent a chill through her, a stark reminder of the loneliness that soaked this place. This was a house haunted by loss. He led her not to the main door, but around to a small lean-to where a pump stood over a well. He worked the handle, and after a few dry, protesting squeals, water gushed out, clear and cold. He gestured for her to drink, to wash. She plunged her hands and face into the stream, the shock of the cold a sudden, clean pain that made her feel real again. She washed the dust from her feet, the grime from her arms, the memory of the town from her skin. Inside, the house was spare and clean. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a shelf with a few plates and a single, chipped cup. A door led to another room. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and a faint, lingering scent she couldn't place, something like dried lavender. It was the smell of a life that had been lived here, and then had stopped. He pointed to the second door. "That's your room," he said. He didn't say it was his wife's room, but she knew. "There's a cot, a blanket. You'll be safe." She looked at the door, then back at him. Her eyes asked the question she could not voice. He seemed to understand. "I don't lock doors here," he said, his gaze steady. "Not on this house. Not on anyone." It was a contract, offered and accepted in the quiet space between his words. Food, shelter, safety. Nothing more was promised. Nothing more was asked. She walked into the small room and closed the door behind her. The soft click of the latch, the first sound of a new, uncertain life. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. A slow, quiet routine stitched itself together with the raw thread of unspoken understanding. He would rise before the dawn, his movements quiet as he stoked the embers in the hearth. By the time the first pale light touched the windows, he would be gone, out mending the fences that sagged like tired shoulders or tending to the few head of cattle that were his livelihood. She would wake to the smell of coffee, a tin mug of it always left for her on the edge of the hearth, still warm. She would drink it, the bitterness a sharp, clean taste. Then she would begin her own work. She swept the floors, the rhythmic whisk of the broom a comfort. She scrubbed the grime from the single window until the light that came through was clear and unfiltered. She learned the quirks of the old wood stove, coaxing a steady heat from it. They worked in parallel, two solitary planets orbiting the same sun of necessity. They rarely spoke. There was no need. She saw the stack of shirts that needed mending, the buttons missing, the cuffs frayed. She found a needle and thread in a small wooden box in her room, Sarah's room, and sat in the evenings, her small, quick stitches pulling the worn fabric back together. He would find the mended shirt folded on his cot, and the next day, he would leave a small block of soap by the water pump for her. One afternoon, she walked to the grave under the cottonwood tree. The fence around it was simple but well kept. The cross read simply, Sarah, 1855 to 1880. There was a smaller, unmarked stone beside it. She knelt and pulled the few stubborn weeds that grew there, her fingers gentle in the hard-packed earth. She found a single, resilient desert bloom, a splash of defiant purple, and laid it on the larger grave. When Elias came in from the fields that evening, he didn't mention it. But as he sat at the table, he kept glancing toward the window, toward the tree, and the harsh lines around his mouth seemed to soften, just for a moment. The food became a language. His cooking was functional, born of necessity. Salt beef, hard biscuits, beans. It was fuel. When she began to cook, using the meager supplies from the pantry, something shifted. She found wild onions growing near the creek bed and herbs he didn't know the names for. The stews became richer. She learned to make bread that rose, light and soft. One evening, he sat eating the bread she had baked. He tore a piece off and chewed it slowly, thoughtfully. "That loaf died in vain," he said, his voice flat. She looked up, startled, a flicker of fear in her eyes. A corner of his mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. "My biscuits feel insulted." It was the first time she had heard anything close to a joke from him. A small, shaky breath escaped her. "Yours are a little dry. You didn't complain about mine last week," he countered, his eyes holding hers for a second longer than usual. "I was hungry last week," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. The conversation was a tiny, fragile bridge built between them in the flickering firelight. The nights were the hardest. The silence of the plains would press in, and the memories would come for her, shadows with sharp teeth. One night, a dream clawed its way out of her throat and she woke with a strangled cry, sitting bolt upright in the dark, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. The room felt small, suffocating, like a box. She heard a soft sound from the main room, the floorboards creaking. He was awake. She held her breath, expecting the door to burst open, expecting anger. Instead, there was only silence. Then, his low voice came through the thin wood of the door. "You're safe. Nothing out here but the wind." She didn't answer, but she slid from the cot and went to the door, cracking it open. He was sitting at the table, a silhouette against the dying orange glow of the hearth. He wasn't looking at her, but out the window at the vast, star-dusted darkness. He was just there, a guardian in the quiet, a wall against the encroaching night. She went back to her cot and, for the first time, slept without dreams. A few days later, as they sat by the fire, the silence between them had changed. It was no longer a void, but a shared space. "Why?" she asked, the single word a stone dropped into the quiet. Her voice was thin, rusty from disuse. He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dancing shadows. He knew what she meant. Why her? Why take her from Carlton? He stared into the flames for a long time, as if the answer were written in the shifting coals. "My wife, Sarah," he began, his voice rough. She believed people deserved a choice. Even when they thought they didn't have 1 inch, he paused, his hands resting on his knees, his knuckles white. "We were to have a child. A boy. He didn't make it through his first winter," he swallowed, a difficult, heavy motion. "Sarah followed him that spring. The house got quiet. Too quiet." He looked at her then, his eyes clear and direct, holding a pain so deep it was almost peaceful. "I saw you in that town square, and I heard the quiet. It was the wrong kind. A cruel kind." He looked away, back at the fire. Fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. "I guess I was just tired of the ash." She didn't know what to say. There were no words for a grief that vast. So she simply sat with him in the warmth, her presence a silent testament to his confession. She had been bought to fill a silence, but not in the way she had feared. She was not a replacement. She was a different sound entirely, a new note in a song he thought had ended. And in that shared warmth, for the first time since she had been tied to that post, she felt the first fragile tendrils of trust begin to uncurl within her. The peace they had built was as fragile as a skim of ice on morning water. It was broken by the sight of 3 riders on the horizon, dark shapes moving slowly against the pale sky. They were not neighbors. Neighbors didn't ride in a tight, purposeful formation like that. Elias saw them from the fence line he was repairing. He straightened up, his body going still, his hand resting on the handle of the hammer at his belt. He watched them for a long minute, their path leading directly, inevitably, toward his home. He dropped the hammer, turned, and walked back to the house, his strides long and urgent. She was on the porch, shaking out a blanket, and she saw the look on his face. The quiet calm was gone, replaced by a hard, focused intensity. She followed his gaze to the approaching riders, and a cold knot formed in her stomach. She recognized the swagger of the man in the lead, even from a distance. "Carlton." "Go inside," Elias said, his voice low and tight. "Stay there." But she didn't move. She just stood there, the blanket clutched in her hands like a shield. The life she had found here, this quiet space of breathing and baking bread and mending shirts, was about to be torn away. The thought of being dragged back to that town, to that post, was a physical sickness. She would not hide. Not this time. The riders reined in their horses a few yards from the porch, kicking up a cloud of contemptuous dust. Carlton sat his horse like a king on a shabby throne, a smirk playing on his lips. His 2 companions were rough-looking men, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. "Elias?" Carlton called out, his voice oozing a false heartiness. "A bit far out for a social call, I know, but I've come on business." His eyes slid past Elias to fix on her. "I've come to collect my property." Elias didn't move from his spot at the top of the porch steps. He stood between Carlton and the girl, a human wall. "She's not property," he said, his voice dangerously level. "And she's not yours." Carlton chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Oh, I think she is. We had a deal. A game of cards. You settled a debt, you didn't buy her. There's a difference in the law, Elias. A big difference. She was collateral. I'm just here to reclaim her." His argument was a twisting of words, a claim of ownership dressed up in the rags of legality. He was turning their sanctuary into a battleground, his entitlement the invading army. "The deal is done," Elias said, his hands hanging loose at his sides. He looked calm, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his body was coiled like a spring. "You took the money. You ride out now." "I don't think so," Carlton said, his smile vanishing. He nodded to one of his men. "Get her." The man started to dismount, a confident sneer on his face. And it was then that something inside the girl broke. Not her spirit, but the cage of fear that had held it for so long. She stepped forward, out from behind Elias's protective shadow. The blanket dropped from her hands. Her chin was up, her dark eyes blazing with a fire Elias had never seen before. "No," she said. Her voice was not the thin whisper he was used to. It was clear, sharp, and carried across the dusty yard like the crack of a whip. The man paused, 1 foot out of the stirrup, surprised. Carlton looked at her, his eyes wide with disbelief and then narrowing with rage. "You don't get a say in this, girl." Elias took a half-step to the side, not to block her, but to stand with her. They were a unified front now, 2 solitary figures presenting an unbroken line. He didn't draw a weapon. His stillness was his threat. His presence was his claim. "You heard her," he said. Carlton's face flushed a deep, mottled red. His authority was being challenged not just by the stoic rancher, but by the very object he had come to claim. It was an intolerable insult to his pride. He swung down from his horse, his bulk making the ground shudder. He strode toward the porch, his hand raised. "I'll teach you your place." He never finished the sentence. As he reached the bottom step, she moved with a speed that was shocking. She closed the distance between them in 2 quick steps and slapped him across the face. The sound was like a pistol shot in the tense silence. It was not a weak, fearful blow, but a strike of pure, focused defiance. An act of profound reclamation. Carlton stumbled back, his hand flying to his cheek, his face a mask of stunned fury. His men were frozen, unsure what to do. They had come for a girl, a piece of property. They were not prepared for this woman. "Get off this land," Elias said, his voice now cold as a river stone in winter. "Now!" Carlton stared, his mind struggling to process his humiliation. He looked at Elias's unyielding stance. He looked at the girl, who stood her ground, her eyes still burning. He saw the fire in her, and he saw the man who would feed that fire until it consumed anyone who threatened it. He was a bully and a coward, and like all bullies, he folded when faced with true, unshakable strength. He turned without a word, his face contorted in a silent snarl, and hauled himself back onto his horse. His men, looking relieved to be leaving, followed suit. They wheeled their horses around and rode away, their retreat as ignominious as their arrival had been arrogant. She and Elias stood on the porch, watching until they were nothing more than small, dark specks swallowed by the vastness of the plains. The wind blew, carrying away the dust and the tension, leaving behind only the wide, open silence of their land. She was trembling, the aftermath of adrenaline and fear shaking her frame. She wrapped her arms around herself. "I was scared," she whispered to the empty air. "I know," Elias said, his voice soft. He didn't move to touch her, but his presence beside her was a comfort more solid than any embrace. He looked at her, not with pity, but with a deep, quiet respect. "You didn't run." No, she thought. She hadn't. For the first time, she had stood. She had fought. Here, on this dusty porch, next to this quiet man, she had claimed herself. She looked around at the humble house, the listing barn, the endless sky. It wasn't just his land anymore. It was hers, too. She had defended it. That evening, the fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter, warmer. The quiet that settled over the house was different again. It was the quiet of a fortress after a siege, secure and peaceful. As she set 2 plates on the table, Elias spoke, his voice gentle. "I don't know your name," She stopped, a plate in her hand. It was a question she hadn't considered. The names she'd been called were not names at all, but labels. Girl, stray, property. They were things that had been stuck to her. She searched inside herself for a name that was her own and found nothing but echoes. I do not have one, she said, the admission tasting like dust. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze taking in the strength in her face, the resilience that had bloomed in the shelter of his home. Lena, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a gift. Lena sounds right. She tried the name out in the silence of her own mind. Lena felt clean, felt new, felt like her. A small smile, the first genuine smile he had ever seen from her, touched her lips. I like Lena. His answering smile was small, but it reached his eyes, chasing away some of the winter that lived there. The giving of the name was a final, binding stitch, pulling the disparate threads of their lives together into something new and whole. The next morning, he found her by the wreckage of the fence Carlton's horses had trampled. She was holding a post, trying to set it back into the hard earth. He came and stood beside her, took the heavy mallet from the ground, and began to work. They rebuilt it together, side by side, their movements falling into an easy, shared rhythm. They were not just mending a fence. They were rebuilding their world, driving the posts deep, making it strong enough to withstand any storm. That afternoon, he returned from a ride with a small, awkward bundle. He handed it to her. It was a pair of sturdy leather boots, just her size. She looked from the boots to his face, her eyes wide. You can't build a life barefoot, he said simply. Later, as dusk settled, painting the sky in strokes of blood orange and bruised purple, they sat together on the porch steps. The house behind them was no longer an empty, hollow shell. It breathed. It held the smell of baking bread, of wood smoke, of two lives intertwined. Lena leaned her head back against the post. The worn would warm against her hair. Elias sat beside her, whittling a piece of scrap wood into the shape of a small bird. The silence between them was a soft blanket, a shared language of peace. He was no longer just the stoic protector, and she was no longer the discarded innocent. He was Elias, she was Lena, and in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, under the endless, watching sky, they had found their home. This story, it isn't just about a rescue. It's about how the deepest wounds are the ones that leave no visible scar, and how the most profound healing can happen in the silences between two people who have nothing left to lose. It's about the difference between being owned and being seen. Carlton saw property, a thing to be won and used. Elias saw a person, a soul shuttered away in a house of pain, and he didn't break down the door. He just stood outside and waited, offering the quiet dignity of choice. Sometimes, a life isn't saved by a grand gesture, but by 1,000 small unspoken kindnesses. A cup of coffee left on a hearth, a mended shirt, a shared meal, the unspoken promise that you don't have to lock the door at night. These are the things that rebuild a person from the inside out. They are the threads used to stitch a life together when the old one has been torn to shreds. And the naming, a name is the first and last thing we truly own. To be without one is to be invisible. To be given one, to be called by it with kindness, is to be born again. So here's your naming. You are not your past. You are not the labels others have tried to stick to you. You are the person who survives the fire, the one who learns to stand on their own 2 feet, the one who finds the courage to say no and defend the small patch of ground you've claimed as your own. If you are brave enough to sit in the quiet, if you are strong enough to accept a kindness without suspicion, you might just find that the most desolate landscapes can become a home. You might just find that the deepest silences are full of love.